way, dears, my light is fixed. After like a month, I have an overhead light. My lighting looks normal again, and I am so excited about it. Also, speaking of excited, I've been waiting to make this video for a very long time, and I am so excited about it. I went to the Immersive Van Gogh exhibit thingy over the summer with my family, and I had to like take time afterwards to sit and journal about how it made me feel terrible and try to understand why that was, and that kind of led me here. Also Artaud, because I could talk about Artaud for hours. But we have other things to talk about before we get to him. So, yes, as always, if you're new here, hi there, hello, my name is Sydney, my pronouns are they, them. I am a 20-year-old white person with curly, light brown hair that's in a ponytail, and I am wearing a navy blue and white striped shirt, and I'm sitting in front of a bookshelf that has a stuffed animal dragon on it. I am an openly queer, autistic, trans, disabled actor, advocate, and educator, and I'm working on a thesis educating y'all about creating accessible classrooms, what accessible theater looks like, and also anything else in the realm of psychology, disability, theater, performance, science, etc. that may interest me, and it's culminating in the world's first all neurodivergent cast and crew production of The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, in which I will be directing and playing Christopher. And if you want to learn more about all of that, everything is linked for you in the description, which you should check out. Also, if you want to support me, you can do that by liking, commenting, subscribing, and or leaving a super thanks if you so desire, but also absolutely no pressure at all whatsoever. Just like to lay out the options in case you need them, because I forget that things exist until somebody recommends them to me. And yeah, either way, glad to have you here. Today we're going to talk about the trope and maybe myth, we're going to get there, of the tortured artist. So let us start by defining our terms. The tortured artist is a cliche most of us are familiar with. The writer hunched over a desk with wine and cigarette butts littering the room, furiously typing to soothe their manic state. The painter who suffers from schizophrenia and suicidal tendencies, but through the pain produces breathtakingly authentic work. The musician with depressive tendencies and a severe drug problem who pours melancholy into his lyrics. And the thing is, this idea is everywhere. Think Frida Kahlo, Jackson Pollock, Sylvia Plath, Virginia Woolf, Schumann, Vincent van Gogh, obviously, Beethoven, Ernest Hemingway, Edgar Allan Poe, Spalding Gray, Sarah Kane, Antonin Artaud, even Robin Williams and Kurt Cobain fall into this category. There are literally hundreds of quotes linking madness and genius. Here are some of my favorites that I found. We have Aristotle's, "There's no great genius without a touch of madness." Masashi Kishimoto's, "The difference between insanity and genius is measured only by success and failure." E.B. White's, "Genius is more often found in a cracked pot than in a whole one." Artaud saying, "There is in every madman a misunderstood genius whose idea, shining in his head, frightened people, and for whom delirium was the only solution to the strangulation that life had prepared for him." Edgar Allan Poe's, "Men have called me mad, but the question is not yet settled whether madness is or is not the loftiest intelligence, whether much that is glorious, whether all that is profound does not spring from disease of thought, from moods of mind exalted at the expense of the general intellect." And of course we have the Robin Williams quote, "You're only given a little spark of madness, you mustn't lose it." And please know that finding all of these quotes also took me like less than 5 minutes, and these are only a couple of my favorites. We see people talking about this link all the time. But let's talk specifically about Robin Williams for a second. An article that I read on the harm of the tortured artist trope talked about how they specifically remember people saying after Robin Williams' death that he was so good at making other people happy because he wasn't happy himself. And they felt like, again, I was hearing that a performer's mental illness was what set them apart from everyone else, what made them the best. And you can probably tell why that view of artists has some serious issues, not just for how we treat artists, but also how we treat people in general and how we rationalize our own struggles and look at mental illness. But again, getting ahead of myself a little bit, we need to define the rest of our terms here. What is madness? Now, madness is another term for neurodivergency, mental illness, mental health issues, and or mental disability, whatever term you want to use. I'm using the term madness more often in this video than I typically do because all the other terms in the category directly reflect our most recent understandings of these experiences, and often those are medicalized understandings of these experiences, which, first of all, did not exist until very recently, so in a historical context, it makes way more sense to use the term madness. And there's also the element of reclamation by the mad community that I have personally been thinking about for a while, and I'm still kind of wrapping my brain around that concept, to be honest. But then the next question is, who defines madness, right? Like, where does this come from? And we've talked about this before as well, how a lot of mental illness is in fact just a completely rational response to how we are treated in the world, and how neurotypical people don't really exist because the idea of somebody being a robot who can conform to the system and be typical and neuronormal is just as problematic as the idea of somebody who struggles to conform being ill, and how everybody struggles in their own ways with the system, and how all of the struggles are presented differently, and some of those we pathologize because they're less productive than others. You can learn about that over here. And since I'm in a quoting mood in this video, much to the dismay of editing Sydney, how far is it possible to pin down mental disorder as an organic, corporeal, scientific concept? And what part does language play in doing this? The line between character denunciation and illness is not at all clear. I have never had to pronounce the word corporeal. I've never had to pronounce that in real life, so sorry if that was wrong. Also, we're gonna look at this quote about how Artaud connects madness and institutionalization directly to imperialism and colonization, like in the early 1900s. Well, like mid 1900s. Who has the right to judge whom, and what does it mean to have different and competing grasps of realities? Beautiful, well done everybody. Basically, madness is a social construct, and those who are oppressed and or on the fringes of society are usually the ones who are considered mad. We saw a trend in the early 1900s of husbands finding that their wives were too headstrong and wanted to have their own beliefs, and so they would send them to institutions and consider them to be mad just because they were fighting against the system of patriarchy. But then again, much like physical disability, while most of the barriers are social and systemic for mad people, even in a utopian world, mental illness can still be disabling to people. Is that bad? No, impairment is not inherently bad, but it does need to be accommodated for and acknowledged, and we need to acknowledge that while the category of mental disability is a social construct, the experiences and the struggles are still very valid within that social category. All right, so back to the main topic. There's this idea that there's an inherent connection between madness and art, and we have a massive amount of examples of this being the case, but is this connection real? Well, let's look at the Sylvia Plath effect. Sylvia Plath was an author and poet who struggled with mental health issues and ended up taking her own life, and the effect is described by the lovely Wikipedia as the phenomenon that poets are more susceptible to mental illness than other creative writers. The term was coined in 2001 by psychologist James C. Kaufman. And this effect has been backed up by research. We know that women are twice as likely to be depressed in comparison to men. We know that female poets are more likely to experience mental illness in comparison to any other class of writers, regardless of gender. Women writers in comparison to general women in other high-profile professions are the most likely to be mentally ill, and in general, the relationship between mental illness and people in creative professions is really well documented. There's also a high correlation between creatives with mental health issues and their parents also having mental health issues and high levels of creativity. Now, if we look at this from the perspective of a researcher, my first thought is, okay, but there's also a lot of strong correlation between mental illness and atypical social skills well documented in prolific scientists and mathematicians and philosophers. So yes, I agree that the correlation is for sure there with creatives and it's significant, but I also think that maybe that correlation might just, I don't know, be everywhere and we're just picking and choosing what we want to study, you know? The second thing that sets off a bit of a red flag is that the research of women writers having higher levels of mental illness in comparison to men writers, we're going to ignore the frustrating amount of gender binary we have going on here. Of course, women are going to be more mentally ill in comparison to men, just in general, typically, because our views of what is mentally right and what is mentally wrong are based on male societal norms, and the idea of women being hypersensitive and hysterical is still very prominent in our mental health system. And we also know that the more discrimination a person experiences in day-to-day life, the worse their mental health is going to be. And that's a very obvious causal correlation that we have well studied. And women typically experience more discrimination than men just based on gender, so therefore they're gonna have more daily stress, therefore they're gonna have a harder time coping with things in relation to anxiety and depression. I would also argue when it comes to discrimination causing stress, causing mental illness, we also know that in general artistic communities tend to be more queer, and that in most of history and also the present, being queer has been an issue with a lot of discrimination and not being able to live the happy life that you want to live because of your queerness and having that be illegal. So I think that also might tie into this trope. I couldn't find any research on this because I just came up with the idea as I was filming, but I think that also might be an important thing to mention. The third thing is, in reference to the studies into the relationships between parents and children, we know that mental illness and neurodivergency are hereditary, not just in the genetic sense, but also in the way that parents teach their children how to interact with the world in the same way that they interact with the world. So there's going to be significant overlap in coping mechanisms and mental illness there. Also, these studies kind of make it seem like they're researching exclusively creatives and non-creatives, and that is not an objective measure, because if you looked at my immediate family through this lens, you would go, all right, so Sydney's parents are both scientists and so is Sydney's sister. So Sydney's an artist and they're the odd one out. But you're missing the fact that my parents have also done professional level musicianship throughout their entire lives. My dad used to be a pilot, and I only do the arts because that's what my sister used to do, and I followed in her footsteps, and I decided to stay in that world. And all of my family members incorporate arts into everything that they do in their objective scientific jobs, because scientific jobs are not objective and scientific. And while I identify as an artist mainly, and giving the choice to go in that direction as opposed to science, 9 times out of 10, that's where I would go, I am on some level very much a scientist, so these categories are not at all explicit. Basically what I'm trying to say is that you can take a whole heck of a lot of research and use it to prove your point or prove the existence of some effect, but that does not mean that that's what the research is actually telling you, because by definition, in order to research things, we have to divide things into binaries and categories and reduce them, and things cannot be explicitly controlled in the world the way that they are in a lab setting. Can you tell that I hate my statistics class? Anyway, that was a whole rant moment. Just making sure that we all practice some critical thinking, because that's a skill that I think that people are sorely lacking. But all of that being said, however, we have spoken before in this channel about the relationship between madness and genius in our discussions of neurodivergency and literature, which is one of my special interests, so we talk about it a lot. And also, we kind of talked about it in my Why Every Broadway Character is Autistic video as well. There's for sure significant overlap, and we can see that. And in mainstream society, we see this narrative a lot, specifically in relationship to how people with depression and autism and bipolar disorders make better artists. A lot of folks equate the manic energy of being bipolar with the creative spark that drives artists to brilliance. When we imagine artists, like I said earlier when describing the trope, we imagine somebody up at random hours of the night in the middle of a dimly lit room, furiously working on a project with papers and paint spills and just utter chaos all around them and not noticing any of it. And again, that's not really art specific, because when you think about what Einstein or Nikola Tesla's labs probably look like, you're probably picturing a very similar image. It's just science stuff instead of paint and art things. But let's examine this phenomenon further by talking about a few case studies. The first is shorter because we're going to talk about this another time if I can find more research into it, because it's becoming a bit of a black hole that I can't get out of. But the connection between mental illness, institutionalization, and modern forms of performance is way more closely linked than you might expect it to be. And again, working on a video about the history of institutions, and it's going to be really great, but it's also going to be a while because it's emotionally exhausting for me to research. So I feel like I need to do it. I'm going to do it, but it's taking a while. But the rise of institutionalization was at the exact same time that we saw the rise of capitalism and eugenics and the need for everything to be scientific. And also the modern school system, which I complained about before. Not surprising, every time we talk about disability history, we somehow end up in the mid to late 1800s. Just consistently. And during this time, scientists and doctors believed that theater and performance could help fix madness on some level. They were kind of stuck pretty strictly to comedy and farce because everybody was afraid that tragedy would just be too much for the patients to handle. But it was typical for inmates to write and put on their own shows in the asylums, and the public would pay to come and see them. So was this the genuine interest of the type of performance, or more of a freak show sort of gimmick? I'm gonna let you decide what you want to think about that. But a lot of theater practitioners did actually go to these performances with serious intentions to learn about a new way of looking at theater. And if you're familiar at all with the Dadaist or Surrealist movements, this is actually where they originated from. Both movements wanted to separate themselves from traditional artistic movements because they were frustrated with what humanity was and what it was becoming, and they wanted to use their art to change humanity, so they needed to change art. So they regularly went to asylum shows and they wrote about how they felt like this was the core of humanity and that mad people truly understood what was going on and that they had this level of authenticity and primitiveness that they wanted humanity to go back to. Dadaists specifically focused on trying to emulate that primitive, natural, authentic human experience reflected by childhood and insanity, while Surrealists focused more on the dreamlike and trance-like catatonic, altered states of consciousness reflected by insanity. Which, as somebody who studied Dadaism in depth when I was abroad, and we did a couple days intensive unit on it, I felt deeply uncomfortable because I felt like I was watching other people try on madness and neurodivergency just to see what would happen, while I had to reconcile the fact that, like, oh, you're privileged enough to feel free enough to just try that on for fun. Meanwhile, I've been literally abused out of doing those exact same behaviors naturally, and it made me feel really gross. And now that I know the history behind it, I understand precisely why that was the case. Again, why am I unpacking trauma as a thesis? That shouldn't have to happen. I don't know, but this is the world that we live in. Now, speaking of trauma, And feeling deeply uncomfortable watching people try on disabilities just for the fun of it, that leads us to our next case study of Antonin Artaud. And I unironically loved this guy. So my man Artaud was a writer. He lived from 1896 to 1948. He struggled with a lot of mental health issues and spent a lot of his life in and out of various asylums, institutions, mental hospitals, whatever you want to call them. At one of these, he was prescribed an opiate that was supposed to help his symptoms, I guess, but he became very much addicted and he struggled with other addictions throughout his life. But at the same time of all of this, he worked as an actor, he joined the Surrealist movement, and then he got kicked out because he was really into mysticism and they didn't quite like that. He co-founded a theater in Paris and he created a form of theater called Theater of Cruelty. And we're going to get into that shortly, but for right now, just know that this is one of the lineages of modern performance art. A lot of famous people like Beckett, Grotowski, Peter Brook, and Beck based their practices on Artaud's Theater of Cruelty. Artaud is also known today for his anti-institutionalist writings, which are still regularly used and quoted by the community in support of his cause. His mystical writings about his suffering and his drawings from the mental asylums and institutions in which he was incarcerated have set in motion much work in critical theory and have shaped some of the heritages of madness as reclaimed visionary expression. A lot of his writings, as we talked about earlier, discuss the issues with defining madness, with madness as a form of colonization and reclaiming madness as a positive attribute. And I appreciate the guy, I really, really do. But let's go back to the Theater of Cruelty. So he coined the term theater of cruelty to capture his vision of theater, in which a visceral attack on the senses would be used to confront what he saw as a diseased society. He used this form to shock and confront the audience, to go beyond words and connect with the emotions, to wake up the nerves and the heart. He believed gesture and movement to be more powerful than text. Sound and lighting could also be used as tools of sensory disruption. The audience, he argued, should be placed at the center of a piece of performance. Theater should be an act of organized anarchy. And some of you who know me well enough at this point are probably gonna go, are you, a staunch pacifist and a proponent of accessible theater, seriously going to defend Theater of Cruelty? Yes. Yes, I am. So when I was abroad, another student in my program was fascinated by Theater of Cruelty, and we did a workshop in Artaud's style, kind of based in his manifesto. And to be honest, it sucked, but I learned the most from that experience than anything else that we did the entire semester, and I still think about it like daily. When I say that it sucked, I mean that like the student did an incredible job. Theater of Cruelty is just a horrible experience, as one would assume by the name, but he did it tastefully, so shout out to that student. I'm not gonna name you because I forgot to ask if you wanted that, but I love you. But anyway, brief rundown of the workshop. We had a lot of discussions beforehand about safety and comfort levels and whatnot, and I specifically was like, I am scared, and we talked about it and it was okay. So it was done to be very careful and as trauma-informed as it could be. Very sure Artaud did not do that, but basically our traditional rehearsal space was completely covered in blackout curtains and like paper, so you couldn't see anything, and we were all wearing black t-shirts or black sports bras and black shorts. A lot of the guys didn't wear shirts at all. Artaud was a big fan of making his performers perform and like only act in complete nudity. We did not do that, for obvious reasons. But in the workshop, we basically went into the space one by one. We kept our eyes closed the whole time. I think the workshop was like an hour and a half long, but I'm not sure about that because time passed differently and I genuinely don't know. But anyway, we did like a reverse guided meditation. So like when we went into the space, we all lay down on the floor. I went by a side corner because I knew that if I melted down, I wouldn't get stepped on. And the guided meditation was like reverse because all the thoughts being put into our heads, instead of being relaxing, were very horrible. And then we were given directions on kind of where to go from here, and people started to move around and use these horrible instruments for terrible soundscaping, and there was a lot of screaming and movement and whatever. My autistic little brain had a complete little shutdown, and I curled in a corner for the entire time and cried. But at the end of it, the student started to play relaxing music. He took down all the blackout curtains and slowly let in the sunlight and let all of us kind of readjust to this universe that we actually lived in. And we sat and talked about our experiences. And it was the first time in my life that I heard neurotypical people explain and understand what is going on in my autistic mind all the time. They were talking about how cathartic it was to get out all of that energy and how it put them in an altered state where their mind and body was buzzing and their thoughts were all jumping all over the place, and they felt simultaneously out of control and in control, and how they felt like they were seeing the entire world differently, and how they felt like by experimenting with this massive amount of darkness, they were able to see the extremes of everything and felt more able to balance themselves in creating art. And now, we've talked about this before, I get wildly frustrated and pissed off when I'm in educational spaces where people try on my disabilities and then talk about how much they learned from it and how eye-opening it was for them. But the tone of this, it felt more appreciative and reverent and safe and kind than it usually does, if that makes sense at all whatsoever. And also, like, just so you can picture this in your brain, the whole class is sitting in a circle in the middle of the floor, and I am dead silent and exhausted, half slumped against the back wall, trying to figure out how words work and trying to process what I was thinking and what everybody was saying. And there came a point where my brain just like, I realized that that was the thing. My mind felt blank for the first time in who knows how long. I was exhausted, but I felt completely clear-headed. And I started to connect all these dots between what I had experienced and Arto's story and how he struggled with addiction and how he was either really extroverted or really introverted depending on the day, and how he was known for having terrible social skills, and how everything he did was to try to make the world understand how he sees the world in order to make the world a better place for everybody. And everything kind of snapped together, and I just kind of raised my hand and everybody looked at me like, "You're alive?" And I explained how it was very clear to me why he created this form of theater. It was to show the world what was going on inside of his head, to try and make them understand his point of view, to teach actors how to look at the world the way he does so they can actively choose to look at the world differently with intention. And how that was an awful experience for so many people, but it was most relaxing for him because for once in his life, his demons were outside of his head and his own brain could finally think clearly. Do I agree with how he goes about this? No. Do I think that the links between how Theater of Cruelty shows the inside of his brain and how the traditional design of The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime shows the inside of Christopher's brain are painfully clear to me the more that I think about it? Absolutely. And in fact, like, my physical and mental reaction to seeing the National Tour Curious Incident way back when is almost identical to my emotional and physical reaction during the Theater of Cruelty workshop, which is just... this is all mind-boggling to me. And I don't know if I even have a thesis to this section, but I am utterly fascinated by that experience, and I still regularly think about it and how we glorify this man's creativity and what he was able to create, but like, at what cost? Because he was struggling and he was suffering, and he externalized this into a really, really cool yet really horrifying thing that changed the world forever. But then also thinking about the fact, like, he didn't need to suffer to create this. And I want to say, well, he was really smart, and without his struggles, he still would have created something this cool and this impactful, and we need to separate the mental illness from the mind. But that's also not entirely how that works, because like, I am an autistic person, and the way that I look at the world and the way that I create art is directly related to the fact that my brain is autistic, for better or for worse. And I don't want that to change. I just want to be able to live in a world that accommodates that, and that I'm, not miserable because of my mental difference. And I also think that my anxiety and depression and OCD and PTSD on some level make me who I am and how I see the world, and I wouldn't be myself without them. But I also wish that I didn't have to suffer, and I don't think that anybody should, obviously, but we can't separate the mind from the madness because they are so intertwined. And I mean, my general answer to this is that your cool art is not worth your suffering, because you can make cool art without suffering. It'll probably just be different from what you would have created if you were suffering, but I would much rather have a different art and a happy you, So we'll clear this up later. I think I'm just gonna move on from Artaud. I don't know if I'll ever have a solid thesis on this man, and that is okay. Let's talk about Vincent van Gogh. And I know his name is Van Gogh, but we're not doing that today. It's just not happening. I'm sorry. I'm gonna sound elitist if I do that, so I'm just gonna not. Short description of the guy: he lived from 1853 to 1890, took his own life, cut off his own ear, drank some paint, was in and out of institutions and psychiatric hospitals, only became famous after he died, created a massive amount of paintings. Some of his most famous paintings are Starry Night, Sunflowers, Irises. My personal favorite is Almond Blossoms. And he has been in the news of late because some protesters threw soup on sunflowers in mid-October, and the painting is covered in glass, so it is not damaged in that publicity stunt. We can talk about my issues about how, while a lot of direct action does bring attention to your cause, you have to, if you have to explain the extensive metaphorical meaning behind what you did to make people not viscerally mad about it, it's just as elitist, and also you're alienating people from the cause. And while yes, artistic culture is elitist and we're getting there, in general, destroying artwork by disabled people or any people might not be the move, but we're not talking about that. We are moving right along. So Van Gogh had a rough time being a human. People think that he had schizophrenia, bipolar 2, and or autism. Based on his writing style, I'm getting serious autism vibes, but he for sure probably had the other things. And also, we don't need to have specific diagnoses. There's a lot of stuff going on there. Van Gogh was like the poster child of the tortured artist trope. Like, if somebody asked you to name an artist who struggled with mental health issues, I guarantee that your first thought would be, oh, definitely that painter dude who cut off his ear. Not even a question. And knowing that, as I began thesis research over the summer and knew generally that I was probably going to do a video connecting madness and theater, when I saw that this immersive Van Gogh exhibit was going to be in Providence for a few weeks, I immediately got tickets. If you're unfamiliar with what I'm talking about, there's this exhibit thingy, it's traveling the country, where Van Gogh's artworks are turned into moving projections that are on the walls and floor around you, and you get to walk through his artwork and immerse yourself within his story and his creations. And in theory, It's a really cool idea because it's making art more accessible to the masses. It's bringing appreciation for a really cool dude, and it's teaching us to look at art in a new and different way. That being said, I am enough of a disability historian to know that it was going to be entirely inaccessible trauma corn. We're not going to get demonetized, but who knows? Maybe it's not. I had to experience it for myself, and yeah, my family loved it. Everybody there seemed to really, really love it. I was disgusted the whole time. It just felt gross. Like, I just felt like, nah, I really tried to enjoy it, but the more I tried to enjoy it, the more gross I felt. Like, obviously, the first turnoff was walking up to the entrance and seeing a huge, like, warning for sensory things. This might be really bad if you have epilepsy or anything else like that sign. It's not exactly what it said, but general idea. And my brain immediately went, oh, so we're showcasing the art of a mentally disabled person in a way that will likely cause real physical harm to a large portion of people with mental disabilities. That seems both tasteful and good. Yes, let's do that. And then we walked through lots of panels with various quotes of his and a kind of narrative about his life and his art, which was then followed by walking through the 2 rooms with the moving projections of that art. And the lighting design, other than the projections, was everything is pitch black. So it was literally just the projections were the only lights you have. So basically, imagine being in a pitch black room that is only screens. If you have sensory issues, you understand why that's an issue. And there's also music going on. It was fine. It was a little loud. And not in the sense of me being like, I have sensory issues, so everything is too loud, but from this is genuinely too loud for the museum vibes you're trying to curate perspective. Now, before we talk about why I specifically hated all of the things they wrote on those information panels, let me just read to you some of the panels. And also please note that most of this was white text on a patterned background with no drop shadow or outline or anything, which made it wildly difficult to read with eye strain and literally takes 5 minutes to fix in editing, but okay. A short time after the ear incident, Van Gogh commits himself to an asylum in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence. Through bouts of illness, he keeps on working, creating some of his most famous masterpieces like The Starry Night, inspired by the view from his window in the St. Paul Asylum. Madness, pain, ear-cutting despair, desolate poverty, Van Gogh's myth tells the tale of a melancholic martyr who took his own life in an ultimate act of revulsion. By contrast, to follow the evolution of Van Gogh's work is to go from darker shades to the discovery of light and an explosion of pure pigments. Far from the dark madness that accompanies the legend of his genius, Van Gogh's work radiates joy and celebrates life. With great lucidity and an extensive knowledge of color theory, he used complementary colors to exalt as well as to soothe, consciously exploring the symbolic language of color. To experience his work is to open oneself to immense joy and the boundless power of color. What? What can... Okay, I'm hoping that you are all feeling a lot of gross red flag vibes from this as well. I hope that we are, like, you get my vibe enough to be there. I think the first thing that set up alarms was the blatant glorification of this man's pain. The fact that they called him a martyr, like, they made it seem like his suffering existed so we could appreciate this beautiful art, and therefore we should thank him for his sacrifice for the greater good or something, which I viscerally hate on truly every level. But that aside, the general wording of things and the way that they described things felt very clinical and pretentious. Like, they were condescendingly explaining to you what you're supposed to look at, what you're supposed to feel, what you're supposed to take out of seeing this art, which really counteracts your point of let's make art more accessible to the masses so everybody can appreciate it and learn from it, because it makes you feel like there's a wrong way and a right way to look at and appreciate art, which I really hate. And we're also not going to talk about the poor taste that was the gift shop, so moving on. I took some videos of the projections. I will put them up on screen for you right now. I think the projections were really cool. A solid third of them were something I could sensorially handle, and they were really beautiful. But I don't think this is what Van Gogh would have wanted, nor do I think it's really in good taste to present the work of a disabled person in one of the most inaccessible ways possible or glorify their pain and suffering, but I think that as its own art form, it was really cool. And I know that a lot of the footage I took was specifically to use as inspiration for my own work, but the whole thing just felt not good. And all the critiques of it that I can find online are specifically about how it felt kind of cheap for what it cost. And I think there is a conversation to be had there for sure. I think that, yeah. But I also think that's not really the conversation that we should be having about this, and I'm truly confused on why I cannot find a single article complaining about the actual content of the display, and it's making me start to gaslight myself into thinking that maybe I shouldn't have felt this way, which seems wrong. Also, there's a Frida Kahlo one that was just made, and I'm like, guys, stop with the... Anyway, let's talk specifically about why, other than making me feel personally very uncomfortable and attacked in these situations, the idea of a tortured artist is a serious, serious issue. Obviously, the first thing is the glorification of mental illness. We have a tendency to make it seem like these artists are some sort of martyr for the cause. We even call them that in some cases for some godforsaken reason, but they suffered so that we could appreciate their art, which is gross, but it does make sense because humans have a tendency to try and rationalize everything that we possibly can. And we usually rationalize horrible things by saying, well, everything happens for a reason. And I'm not saying that that isn't the case because, like, for me, my brain damage completely turned my life around. And as much as it sucked and I hate it and it shouldn't have happened and I'm pissed about some of the disabilities that I have now, I'm glad that it happened in some weird way. But I also think that, I don't know, those lessons could be taught in less terrible ways. And maybe some horrible things shouldn't have to happen for a reason. But that's a discussion for another day. What I'm trying to say is that we're all very guilty of this. And there's a fine line between this thing happened to me for a reason and I believe that and that's how I cope with it, and this random person suffered so we could experience joy. And the parallels that this is drawing to the Christian mindset of Jesus died for our sins and how that's glorified, and probably directly connects to the fact that the tortured artist trope is the strongest in Christian-dominated Western culture, is a whole thing I didn't realize until right now, but it makes so much sense. But what I'm trying to say, goodness, is that we want to believe that everything happens for a reason. And so when other people suffer, we try to rationalize it that way. And so we try to tell ourselves that suffering and pain is actually very useful, and we should appreciate those who are dedicated enough to do that. It makes us romanticize overworking yourself, putting too much pressure on yourself for a respectable end product. We try to say that, no, people aren't suffering every day with mental illness. They're just not appreciating what they have and that their minds are great and they're different. Depression is a time to reflect and ruminate, and mania is a time for you to think big and be really productive. When you're having the hardest time with your brain, that's the time to be most productive. Just turn that pain into art, make something out of it. Make even you're having hard times, make that even productive and useful. And that is not healthy, and it's also not real, because if you're constantly forcing yourself to continue working when you feel terrible, you're not taking the time to rest and reset and recover so you can, not feel terrible, which you deserve to do, because you do not need to be productive when you feel like death, whether that's physical death or mental death. We don't expect you to spend the week that you're sick with the flu composing an entire opera, so why are we expecting somebody in a depressive episode to do that? Obviously, mental illness and physical illness do not equate each other, and they're not things that we should even try to equate, because recovery and timeline and experience and discrimination look very different between the two things, but my point does still stand. And this idea that mental illness is tragically beautiful, but also only if you're productive during it, otherwise it's just in the way, is really messed up, obviously, and it can be really detrimental to internalize. And we get this idea that it's the madness that makes the artist, which is bad, because then we start to see people as their disorder and as their madness and not as, people who exist. And it means that we start to normalize these symptoms, and it means that people don't get the help that they need. Labeling as manic depressive anyone who's unusually creative, accomplished, energetic, intense, moody, or eccentric both diminishes the notion of individuality within the arts and trivializes a very serious, often deadly illness. And while autism isn't deadly, I also think that on some level, still with individuality thing, that's still an issue. And as a personal example, I got really sick a few years ago, had some brain damage, some fun, funky things happened to my body and brain. Now, as a result, I have a bunch of mental and physical disabilities and health issues that I didn't have before then. Since then, I've also become a lot more music focused, and I'm a lot better at creating and picking up music than I was before. And the extent of my brain damage situation is not really known. We're not 100% sure what specifically caused it. We have some ideas of general things, but yeah, we don't know. We also don't know specifically what the damage is, and also I don't really care because it doesn't change anything to know that. But I have 3 different theories as to why this sudden music skill thing is the case. First one, at the beginning of my recovery, where most brain changes were happening and I was healing, I wasn't really able to walk or read or do anything, so I just listened to music all the time. And I think that my plastic brain kind of just healed to be more geared towards music. 2, since I got sick, I've struggled a lot more with other things that I used to do frequently, like focusing on scientific things, and my ability to take in mass amounts of information in short periods is kind of hindered due to my memory issues, though I've been able to retrain it pretty much. So the fact that music is way easier for me could be because everything else is way harder and that music has stayed at the same level. And 3rd, large sections of my memory were kind of destroyed, and we know that memory for the arts is stored in a different place in the brain from other memories. There have been studies of patients with dementia and Alzheimer's remembering dances or piano pieces absolutely perfectly. So that section is the only part of my memory that's probably still working at full capacity. Though memory is a very plastic thing, and I am retraining it, and it's getting better. But whatever the reason, I've been more musically inclined since then. And when I talk about that with people usually compute that in their heads as, oh, I couldn't do music before, and now I can, so therefore I thank my brain injury for my new genius. Which is not what happened at all, and it separates my talent and the fact that I spent a lot of years working on this pre-brain damage with who I am as a person. Because people start to think that it's the weird brain that can do that skill and not the Sydney with that brain. And that feels very gross to me. And also, like, as a composer, I've always been of the opinion that I write the best work when I'm having a rough time with my brain and I'm very dissociated and spacey, because I start to think more spatially and I start to think more musically. And when I got hired as a composer, I began to get stressed that I can't really write for deadlines. Music comes when it comes. My mental health is getting better and spacey Sydney is a less frequent occurrence. I'm afraid that I'm losing my musical ability. And so I started to make really poor choices to keep my mental health not so great in order to get the musical product that I wanted. And I've since realized how horrible that is, and how I am very talented no matter how I feel. And yes, compositions may come more naturally when I'm dissociated, but I can learn and have learned to write them when I'm not. And I've also realized that my truly focused music with intention is better than what I produced at random when I felt terrible. But for a long time, I was afraid of getting physically and mentally better, because what if doing so made me lose my talent, my artistic power? What if my ability to make good art would leave if I got better? And that's absolutely and entirely screwed up, and yet it's very often the case for people. And I didn't even realize that I was doing this really until I wrote this video. But then if we do realize, okay, maybe I do need help, and we seek out that help, people don't want to give it to us either. What do you mean, Sydney? That sounds absurd, you might be thinking. Let's look at some of the things that have been said directly to my face by professors who so adore their tortured artists when I ask for basic accommodations and/or human rights. I keep a list if you're wondering. Here's some dramatic interpretations of what I've been told. I understand that you're having a hard time, Sydney, but there's something so beautiful about your struggle, and I think that you can really work with it, and I would love to see what kind of art comes out of this. Yes, me nearly getting hospitalized because the chronic stress from your teaching style caused my body to shut down is what came out of it, so thank you. And there was also the one time that the one professor told me that all of his favorite theater practitioners and artists are the ones who took their own lives because it shows that they were really dedicated to the work, which, yikes! That's not cute. But what I find interesting about all of this is that there's a threshold to what level madness is acceptable. Many of the most famous tortured artists were almost universally hated in their lifetimes because of their behavior that was often a result of said madness. And then later in their lives, well, after their lives ended, completely glorified by people who never had to look at their suffering and look at their madness face to face when they were alive. And those people are typically the ones who will see somebody equally mad and struggling in front of them asking to be treated like a human being because they deserve to make art without suffering, and completely dismissing them as a burden who is asking for too much and not being realistic. All while talking about how much they love and admire Artaud and Van Gogh and how dedicated they were to their work. And it's truly fascinating and also infuriating. And this idea of a level of acceptable madness existed with art created in asylums way back when as well. This is not new. Asylums didn't want to publish fully mad pieces, or else their efforts at moral and mental reform would be perceived as ineffective. However, they also did not want to give anyone doubts of the existence of madness within their walls, or they could risk losing funding or social support. Patients had to be both mad and not mad. They had to prove their sanity to overcome the stigma upon release and be able to return to polite society. And this teeter-totter of trying to stay between the acceptable limit of being mad enough and also sane enough to be able to create real art is completely absurd and wrong and bad and no! Just blanket, no. But then the next question, right, is what is real art? Because typically when somebody is in an institution or in a group home or an asylum or mental hospital, psychiatric ward, whatever you want to call it, we often look at the art that they create there and we process that art as, oh, this was part of their therapy, and not seeing that as legitimate or real art. And then on the flip side, if we look at art that we think doesn't have depth to it, we also don't see that as legitimate or real art, such as modern pop music or how people used to feel about Andy Warhol's work. But like, what really declares something good art or valid art? Short answer, if the elite like it. Pretty much that's it. Non-depressed people have made art that the elite love probably as much as depressed people do, but either way, don't measure your success based on how some annoying rich people define success, because that definition is never stable, and also who cares? Well, capitalism does in, making a living, but you know what I mean. The truth behind all of this tortured artist stuff is that mental illness is not what makes you a great artist. We know that mental illness turns on your fight or flight. It puts you into survival mode and it hinders your ability to create. We know that it makes your art objectively worse, and it makes your artist burn out faster and encourages unhealthy coping mechanisms that hinder them more than they could even try to help. It's not that artists create art because of their pain, it's that artists create art period. And they create it to be based around what's going on in their world. So if they're having a rough go of it, that's what their art is going to be about. And if they're not having a rough go of it, that's also what it's going to be about. And if they feel not terrible, they can produce more and better art. I don't think it was the pain that made Van Gogh so great. I think painting brought him whatever happiness he had. And as we've talked about before in this channel, nobody leaves life unscathed. We all have pain and struggle and chaos and suffering because that's what life is. And the fact that we need that in order to grow because it's part of life does not mean that we need to glorify suffering or that in order to make great art, you need to be living in chaos or suffering or overworking yourself. In order to make great art, you need to be a human being. And that's it. Whether being hurt is a necessary requirement to creativity is only true in so much as to live is partly to suffer. You cannot create without suffering because you cannot live without suffering. And you know what? Everything else that I have to say for this section is really summed up by the quotes I found. So again, apologies to editing Sydney. Let's just go through those. Pain does have a purpose. It helps you learn and grow. However, it doesn't make you more interesting or complex, and it certainly doesn't make you more likely to be remembered as a great artist. For many artists, mental illness didn't make them great, it made them ill. And if they weren't careful, it made them gone. We can't always avoid turmoil, but we can do our part to walk toward a sense of peace. We can make an effort to find stillness. Don't hide from chaos behind an easel or computer screen. Face it, learn from it, and then use your creative practice to give it a proper burial. That's how you turn pain into art. That's how you stay human. The myth of the tortured artist should be treated less as an unavoidable consequence and more as a call to action. I owe nobody my suffering to make what is precious to me. So let's go back to the science of it all. We talked about the fact that there is a genuine correlation between madness and art. And we started to think critically about that already, but let's look at it through another lens. If our expectation of a good artist is somebody up at random hours of the night in the middle of a dimly lit room working furiously on a project with papers and paint spills and chaos all around them and not noticing any of it, that's what people are going to try to emulate in order to become a good artist. Human beings do what is expected of them. Artists are supposed to be weird. Artists are allowed to be weird, so artists are going to be weird forever. Some other theories for the correlation is that everyone uses the arts as therapy. Some just prefer to observe those arts rather than create them for therapy. And some are just better at creating therapy art than others are. There's also theories that artists are inherently more sensitive to their emotions and the highs and lows of life, or at least better at articulating and expressing that. And therefore, since they're more open about how they're feeling, we see more characteristic diagnostic criteria and just assume that they're more prone to madness than the general population, solely because that's the only way that we know how to identify madness. Or maybe everybody's mentally ill and nobody is structured to be able to comfortably exist in the weird social structures that make up our society, and this is all just a really big case of confirmation bias because we want to find a correlation between madness and artistic genius, and so we do. And if you look back at art history, all of the greats are the ones who innovated something new and had a good story behind their lives. We like to see people using arts as therapy, feeling like suffering happens for a reason, and so those are the stories and therefore the artists that we're going to repeat more and more and begin to feel like every artist is the exact same way. It's not that the tortured artist isn't real, it's that the tortured artist is a subset of tortured human, along with tortured scientist, and tortured coal miner, and tortured who knows what else. We just focus so much on this trope, and on finding examples for it, that we forget about everybody else. So, where do we go from here? I don't know, honestly. Researching this made me realize how much of this I have bought into and how much it has fueled my own imposter syndrome as a creator and as an artist, and I still have a lot to process on this topic, so I don't really have a solid answer of what now. But I think that we can look at this as a reminder that all humans are struggling and that we all deserve to not struggle because we don't owe anybody our suffering at all ever, and we should be nicer to ourselves. And I think that we can start to think more critically about the narratives that we keep pushing, particularly with Van Gogh and other tortured artists, and how that may impact people today. And maybe we should all just point blank accommodate people, rather than telling them that asking for help hinders their art production. Because that's not cute. I will include all of my sources in the description for you. There are quite a lot, including a very important and well-written video essay on how to write madness tastefully if you're a creator and you want to do that. I would love to know your thoughts on any of these things, particularly the immersive Van Gogh exhibit, because I just need somebody to validate me about that. But I'm also interested in literally anything else you have to say as well. I always love learning from you guys. And as always, thank you for listening. Thank you for learning. Remember, it is never too late to start over. I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.